Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about the High Elves in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, and one aspect of the race that is completely broken and hopefully Creative Assembly will be fixing in Tides of Torment, assuming the High Elves are the third race alongside Slaanesh and Norska. And what's broken is the influence system. You use influence in two principal ways. One, you can use it in Intrigue at Court for various diplomatic dealings, like improving relationships with factions, decreasing relationships between factions, all that kind of stuff. But primarily what you use influence for is recruiting lords and heroes with positive traits as opposed to negative traits. And given the fact that you do have negative traits, some of which can certainly be pretty painful, you really want to recruit lords and heroes that at least have some level of positive trait. Even if it's only the 15 influence trait as opposed to the 60 influence trait. But there is a way to completely cheese it through the load save character system. So basically, what you can do in any High Elven campaign, you can play that campaign normally, save up a bunch of characters, and then load those characters into a different campaign. Assuming load save character is available for that campaign. If you're playing a multiplayer campaign, it might not be the case. And this allows you to do some really broken stuff. Because one of the things you can do is recruit a bunch of Archmages with Administrator. What an Administrator does is it reduces construction costs by minus 15% and construction time by minus 20%. Now, this in itself would be pretty broken, and keep in mind, there is a trait lords gain if they're in a region which is constructing stuff. So when they're in region and it finishes constructing stuff roughly 6 times, they start getting the Master Mason build, which also further reduces construction costs. So if you're playing a High Elf campaign, you can get instant and free construction in all of your provinces, or a lot of those provinces. You will be paying in terms of supply lines, because maintaining all those lords is obviously going to hurt you in terms of supply lines, but you'll more than save up a lot of money in the long term because of that instant and free construction. You'll also get more unit variety. Now, the best way of maximizing your supply of heroes and lords in particular, it's more important with lords because heroes obviously have limited hero capacity. So realistically, in most High Elven campaigns, until you get to tier 4, you can only get 1 noble, with the exception of like Alariel, who can get a bunch of handmaidens at tier 3. But most of the time, you will have a very limited supply of heroes, but you can have an unlimited supply of lords. And there's all kinds of benefits with that. But the best way to farm up a lot of these lords, level 1 lords, level 1 heroes, is start playing Elfarian's campaign. That's because when you start Elfarian's campaign, you fight this initial battle in his campaign, you take one settlement, you get this choice between either keeping Torvres or giving it up. Keeping it gives you 120 influence. So as you can imagine, you can use that 120 influence again and again and again to get yourself a bunch of different lords with positive traits. Now, this might take a couple of times doing it, so you might start this campaign over and over and over again until you get Administrator Archmages of the School of Magic that you want. I personally recommend going for Lore of High Magic. That is my personal perspective. But certainly, any kind of Lore of Magic will do the trick over here. And again, you can do this on repeat mode. In this case, I don't really have an Archmage Lord that I want to recruit, but I have saved a bunch of them. So I think Creative Assembly needs to change that entire dynamic. I also think that they need to wipe out the characters that people have already saved up, because it is pretty ridiculous. And from that perspective. But that's just Archmage Lords. There's other things that are really good as well. So for instance, you look at Prince, you get 250 experience per turn and 20% ammunition. Princes are actually the best army leaders for High Elves, because getting 250 experience per turn for an early game army is gigantic. This means that you will start getting veteran armies very, very quickly. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why Alfarian is absurdly broken as a Legendary Lord, because he doesn't even need to use the load save character system in order to take advantage of this. He just has to start playing his campaign normally, and bam, from the very start of his campaign, he can get 2 high-level lords with that kind of trait. And then later on in his campaign, he'll just get enough influence later on that he can recruit them normally. And that is a pretty big deal in his campaign. Like, you know, you play battles, you get influence. But the system as is absolutely rewarding you abusing these kind of gameplay systems. Also, Alfarian is kind of ridiculous in this perspective as well, because he can capture prisoners, and those prisoners can give him influence as well. So you're looking at 4 influence per turn, for instance, for each indoctrinated prisoner. Yes, Alfarian has that kind of capability in terms of like really reaching a lot of power in his campaign. But there is a severe imbalance between the various High Elven campaigns in this respect, because Teclis, Tyrion don't get as much influence. Alifanar does end up getting a lot of influence through his assassination missions fairly quickly. So to the extent that you even need to use the load save character, and depends on the campaign you're playing on, but I do think there is a significant balancing issue between the various campaigns due to the way that influence works. So I really do believe influence needs to be changed. There should not be a case of like, you have Alariel, you have Alfarian, you have Alifanar that just flat out get more influence than the rest. Because they do get more influence than Emmerich, Teclis, Tyrion. So that's one thing that Creative Assembly needs to change. I also think that it's quite silly to have a generic Lord situation where some of them are just so much better than others just because of a trait that they trivialize your entire campaign. Again, like being able to recruit units that are gaining experience automatically every single turn is flat out broken. Maybe influence should work from the perspective that it's something you can invest in on existing heroes and lords to make them better, train them better. Maybe they start down in a neutral state and then you can specialize them. That's just an idea on the subject, but it's absolutely something I think Creative Assembly needs to improve, because it doesn't make High Elf campaigns really that appealing at the moment having to deal with this. But more on the subject of ridiculous traits, we look at nobles. You can get things like Frugal, 5% campaign movement range, 20% ammunition. This, by the way, stacks with the Prince trait that gives you Adept. So a Prince with Adept, 20% ammo, with a hero that also gives you 20% ammo is pretty damn ridiculous. There's, of course, other traits, some of them not necessarily as good as some others, like Honed is just not going to be as good as Frugal. This does bring up a point that, you know, certain traits are just far more valuable than others, like Vigorous between Frugal. Yeah, there's no comparison on that. So there is also the imbalance of traits, and what's pretty frustrating as well is like the fact that these traits are randomized in the sense of what they're going to have on offer. So you might be spending influence on traits that are not as good in order to eventually get heroes that do have those really, really, really good traits. And this applies to handmaidens, this applies to mages, less so for lore masters of Hoef, though they also have those kind of traits as well. I think there is one that gives you casualty replenishment. Handmaidens have an absurd trait that gives you significant growth. And when you combine the idea of instant construction, free construction, and enormous growth benefits, you kind of start understanding how High Elves are broken. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean High Elves are, like, they're very powerful, but when you're playing the whack-a-mole of cheesing the game to an extreme like this, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to a really fun and great campaign experience. And I think that is one of the fundamental aspects that Creative Assembly does need to improve with respect to the High Elves. Regardless of how they do it, there's different options on the subject, but yeah, High Elves always had the element of ridiculousness because of these traits, believe it or not. Like, it's always been the case, like, some of the High Elven traits have always broken their campaigns over and over and over again. But now in Warhammer 3, loads of characters just kind of taken to the logical conclusion of it. Hell, I remember when we got the original Incendiary in Warhammer 2, that was pretty ridiculous as well. Like, you also had Entrepreneur and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think traits should be a way of differentiating heroes and lords, and, you know, some might be better in combat, some might be better on the campaign map. But it shouldn't be a case of completely trivializing your entire economic system and your entire campaign and trivializing ammo management in a battle, for instance. That's my perspective. Let me know what you guys think on this subject. Kostin signing out.